Isabel owned a charming bookstore tucked away on a quiet street, where the scent of fresh coffee blended with the pages of well-loved books. Every corner of the store reflected her passion, from handwritten recommendations to carefully curated shelves. Customers loved her warm smile and welcoming energy, which made the bookstore feel like home. Books bring people together, Isabel often said, her voice full of conviction. However, her boyfriend, Daniel, didn't quite share her enthusiasm for her labor of love. Daniel was a high-powered lawyer with little patience for what he considered small-scale dreams. He admired Isabel's work ethic, but frequently dismissed the store as a hobby rather than a career. "You're so talented, Isabel. Imagine what you could do if you expanded," he'd suggest, his tone bordering on patronizing. Isabel would smile politely, hiding her frustration, and return to the comfort of her books, which always understood her better than he did. Despite Daniel's lack of support, Isabel found joy in her routine. She loved chatting with customers, recommending stories that matched their moods, and watching as they lingered over coffee. The store was her world, a place where stories thrived and dreams felt tangible. It was enough to make her happy, even if Daniel didn't fully understand its significance. Or so she told herself. Every evening, like clockwork, a quiet man entered Isabel's bookstore. He always ordered a black coffee, picked a book from the shelves, and settled into the same corner by the window. Isabel noticed his reserved nature but didn't think much of it at first. He rarely spoke beyond polite pleasantries, and his eyes were always focused on the pages of his book, or so she thought. One evening, as Isabel was rearranging a display, she felt a pair of eyes watching her. Turning her head, she caught the shy man looking in her direction. Their eyes met for a brief second before he quickly ducked behind his book, his face flushed with embarrassment. Isabel couldn't help but smile at the awkward yet endearing moment. Over time, she noticed how consistent his visits were. He'd arrive after work, quietly sip his coffee, and read until closing time. Though their exchanges were limited to a soft thank you or a nod, his presence became a comforting part of her evenings. She wondered what brought him to her store so often but kept her curiosity to herself. Isabel couldn't help but notice the shy man's consistent visits. His reserved demeanor intrigued her, and she found herself stealing glances at him as he read. She wondered what kind of person he was, what books he loved, what brought him here so often, and why he always sat in the same corner. There was something calming about his quiet presence that she couldn't quite explain. Despite her curiosity, Isabel dismissed it as harmless. Her life was already full, balancing the demands of running the store and dealing with Daniel's increasingly dismissive attitude. The bookstore was her sanctuary, a place where she could focus on what truly mattered: her passion for books and her connection with her customers. Still, the mysterious customer became an unexpected highlight of her day. She'd occasionally wonder about his story but never let it distract her from her routines. To her, he was just a regular customer, albeit one who brought a quiet sense of intrigue to her otherwise predictable evenings. As Isabel poured her heart into the bookstore, Daniel grew increasingly frustrated with her dedication. "You spend too much time there," he said one evening, his voice laced with irritation. "Why don't you focus on something bigger, something more meaningful?" His words stung, but Isabel remained calm. "This is meaningful to me, Daniel," she replied, her tone firm but gentle. Their arguments became more frequent, each one chipping away at their connection. Daniel couldn't see the joy and purpose the bookstore brought Isabel, and she grew tired of defending her passion. "You just don't get it," she said during one particularly heated conversation. Daniel, in turn, accused her of being complacent, too afraid to dream bigger. Despite the growing tension, Isabel tried to hold on to their relationship. She reminded herself of the good moments they had shared and hoped things would improve. But deep down, she knew their differences were too great. Her love for the bookstore was a fundamental part of who she was, and Daniel's inability to understand that left her feeling increasingly isolated. One quiet afternoon, Daniel visited the bookstore, his mood already sour. Isabel was organizing a display when he approached her with a frustrated sigh. "I don't understand why you're so attached to this place," he said, his tone sharp. "You could do so much more if you stopped wasting your time here." Isabel froze, his words cutting deeper than she expected. "This isn't a waste of time," she replied, her voice trembling. "This store means everything to me. Why can't you see that?" But Daniel dismissed her passion as insignificant, shaking his head. The argument escalated, voices rising in the otherwise silent bookstore. Isabel, exhausted and hurt, finally said what she had been holding back. "This isn't working anymore. Daniel, I can't keep doing this." Daniel stared at her in disbelief before storming out, slamming the door behind him. Isabel stood frozen for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. Just then, the door opened again, and the shy customer walked in. Noticing her flustered state, he hesitated. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly. Isabel forced a small smile. "Yes, everything's fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed her nerves. He nodded and quietly took his usual spot, offering her an unexpected sense of reassurance. Later that evening, as Isabel was tidying up before closing, she accidentally knocked over a cup of coffee onto the counter. She quickly grabbed a cloth to clean the mess but found herself flustered. Ethan, the shy customer, noticed her struggle and stood up from his usual corner. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice gentle but hesitant. Isabel, surprised by his offer, nodded with a small smile. As they cleaned up the spill together, Isabel couldn't help but notice his kind demeanor. "Thank you," she said, breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to make such a mess." Ethan chuckled softly. "It happens to the best of us." His calm, easygoing attitude put her at ease, and for the first time, they exchanged more than just polite pleasantries. Their conversation drifted toward books, a shared love that quickly bridged the gap between them. Ethan spoke passionately about his favorite genres, his eyes lighting up as he mentioned the stories that had inspired him. Isabel, intrigued by his quiet enthusiasm, found herself asking more questions, genuinely enjoying their exchange. That evening marked a shift in their dynamic. For the first time, Isabel saw Ethan not just as a regular customer, but as someone who understood her world. As he left the store, he turned back and said with a small smile, "You've created something special here, Isabel." Her heart warmed at his words, a welcome contrast to the criticism she had grown used to. Ethan continued to visit the bookstore after work, but now their interactions felt different. Each evening, he'd stay a little longer, sharing more about himself. "I've always loved quiet places like this," he admitted one day, his voice low but sincere. Isabel listened intently, her curiosity growing with every conversation. She found comfort in his presence, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled her recent days. Their discussions often revolved around books, but occasionally, Ethan would share bits of his life. He told her about his job, his introverted nature, and how he often felt more at ease in a bookstore than anywhere else. Isabel admired his honesty, realizing how much courage it took for him to open up. In turn, she began sharing her own stories, including the challenges of running the store. One evening, Ethan surprised her by recommending a book. "This one made me think of you," he said, sliding a worn paperback across the counter. Isabel smiled as she read the title, touched by the thoughtfulness of his gesture. She promised to read it, and the next day, they discussed it as if they'd been friends for years. As the days passed, Isabel noticed how much lighter she felt when Ethan was around. His quiet kindness and shared love for books brought a sense of calm she hadn't realized she needed. What had once been a simple routine now felt like the beginning of something meaningful. One quiet evening, as the bookstore emptied out, Ethan lingered by the counter while Isabel locked the door. "You don't seem yourself today," he said gently, his concern evident. Isabel hesitated, but the sincerity in his tone encouraged her to open up. "It's been a rough few weeks," she admitted, her voice soft. "Ending things with Daniel wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been," he said. "But sometimes, choosing yourself is the bravest thing you can do." His words struck a chord with Isabel, who hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them. For a moment, she felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. In return, Ethan shared a piece of his own story. "I've spent most of my life avoiding risks," he confessed. "Even coming here every day took more courage than I'd like to admit." Isabel smiled softly, realizing how much they had in common. Both had faced challenges in their own ways, finding solace in the quiet corners of life. That evening, they talked until closing time, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Isabel felt a sense of connection she hadn't experienced in years, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of something new. Ethan's quiet strength and understanding made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt with Daniel. Ethan arrived at the bookstore one evening looking unusually nervous. He hesitated at the counter, fidgeting with the book in his hands. Isabel noticed his unease and offered him a warm smile. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He nodded, but it was clear he had something on his mind. Finally, after a deep breath, he said, "I need to tell you something. I've admired you for a long time," Ethan began, his voice trembling slightly. "Not just the store, but the way you pour your heart into it. It's rare to meet someone who creates something so special." Isabel was taken aback by his honesty, her cheeks flushing. She hadn't expected such a heartfelt confession, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. Ethan continued, his gaze fixed on the counter. "I didn't know if I should say anything, especially after everything you've been through. But I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." Isabel placed her hand on the counter, her heart racing. "Ethan," she said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, but thank you. That means more than you know." The vulnerability in his words touched Isabel deeply. While she wasn't ready to dive into something new, she couldn't ignore the warmth that had grown between them. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the idea of a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. In the weeks that followed, Isabel and Ethan's connection blossomed naturally. Their conversations grew longer, their laughter more frequent, and their bond stronger with each passing day. Ethan became an integral part of the bookstore, often helping Isabel rearrange displays or brew coffee during busy afternoons. The bookstore, once Isabel's sanctuary, now symbolized something even greater, a place where two people had found each other amidst life's chaos. One evening, as they sat together after closing, Isabel looked around the cozy shop and smiled. "I never thought this place would bring so much more than books," she said. Ethan chuckled. "It brought us together, didn't it?" Their moments together were filled with small but meaningful gestures. Ethan would leave her handwritten notes tucked into books, and Isabel would surprise him with his favorite coffee on particularly cold evenings. Their relationship wasn't rushed. It was steady, built on trust and a shared love for life's quieter joys. As they sat side by side in the bookstore one evening, Isabel felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The store wasn't just her dream anymore, it was their shared haven. With Ethan by her side, she was ready to embrace this new chapter, knowing that sometimes the best stories begin in the most unexpected places.